Ready for a deep dive. Today, it's Katharine Dexter McCormick. And, she did way more than help create the birth control pill. Her story goes, well, way beyond that.
Yeah, it's really remarkable when you think about it. McCormick's life, it touches on so many major things happening in the 20th century. It's women's suffrage, it's groundbreaking science, even philanthropy.
Yeah.
And driving it all, this incredible woman who, well, she was never afraid to challenge the rules.
And challenge them she did.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about a woman who smuggled diaphragms from Europe, literally hid them in coat linings to advocate for women's health. Sounds like a spy thriller.
It really does. And we're not talking about just anyone here. This is the McCormick family. That McCormick family. The international harvester fortune. But here's the thing. Her wealth. Yeah, it was huge. But it wasn't what defined her. It was this absolute drive to make a real difference.
Okay, so let's talk about that drive. What was it? What fueled that fire in her?
Well, to get that, we got to rewind, go back to her early life. So she's born in 1875, right? And really early on, she goes through some tough stuff, loses her dad, loses her brother, all at a young age.
Wow. Those had to be such formative experiences, especially back then for a young woman.
Absolutely. Think about the impact of that kind of loss, and then on top of it, she's already challenging expectations, like going to MIT. Almost unheard of for a woman at that time. And then, get this, she challenges their rule about women wearing feathered hats.
Hold on, feathered hats. In a science lab. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. What was she thinking?
Well, they didn't call it the Feather Hat Rebellion for nothing, but it shows you something about Katharine, even then. This independence streak. She wasn't afraid to question the status quo, especially these pointless rules just for women.
Definitely ahead of her time. But this is just the start for her, right?
Right. So she graduates with a biology degree in 1904. Pretty amazing for any woman back then. She even thought about medical school, but then life takes a turn. She meets Stanley McCormick, and they get married.
Uh-huh. The international harvester heir. I bet this is where things get really interesting.
They do. Because on the surface, you've got this fairy tale marriage, but then Stanley starts showing signs of what we now recognize as schizophrenia.
So they're dealing with a really serious illness in a time when mental health was, well, so misunderstood and so stigmatized. So here's Katharine dealing with this incredibly difficult personal situation. But instead of, retreating inward, she dives headfirst into the fight for women's suffrage. What was it about this movement that really grabbed her, do you think?
I think to really grasp that, we have to rewind a bit, put ourselves back in her shoes in that time. Women couldn't vote, their property rights were limited, their lives were basically, confined to the home. Katharine saw firsthand how these restrictions, they weren't just ideas, they had real impact on women's lives. Hers included. Remember that defiance at MIT we talked about? This wasn't just about some silly hat rule. It was about something much bigger, much more fundamental.
And she didn't just offer quiet support, right? She was out there on the front lines.
Oh, absolutely. Katharine became a major force in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NWSA, organizing rallies, funding these crucial publications, things like the Woman's Journal. She even spoke at the first outdoor suffrage rally in Massachusetts back in 1909. That was a bold move for a woman back then.
Speaking out like that back in those days, that took guts. It wasn't just the words, was it? It was like a direct challenge to, the whole system.
Exactly. And Katharine was smart about it. She used her wealth strategically. She knew money meant influence, and she used it to move the needle, to make real progress.
So it wasn't just about writing checks. She was like a strategist for a cause she deeply believed in.
Exactly. And through her work with the NWSA, she connected with some incredible women, other pioneers fighting for change. People like Carrie Chapman Catt, Margaret Sanger. These were giants in the movement.
Wait, Margaret Sanger? The founder of Planned Parenthood. Okay, now those dots are starting to connect. That's huge.
Right. It all comes together. And their initial connection, it was through that shared goal of women's suffrage. It was a bit later that their partnership on birth control really took off.
And this is where those smuggled diaphragms come back in.
You got it. Katharine used her money, her connections, to literally smuggle contraceptives from Europe. Can you imagine the audacity? This wasn't just, it's technically illegal in some states. This was a direct challenge to everything people thought about women's roles back then.
It really makes you wonder, what she'd think about the debates we're still having today about reproductive rights, the fight for control over your own body. It was her fight a century ago, and it's still so relevant.
It's true. It's a sobering thought. But before we jump too far ahead, let's get back to Katharine's other passions. Remember, Through all of this, she was dealing with a very personal struggle. Her dedication to finding a cure for Stanley's illness never wavered. That was a driving force for her.
That's right. It's easy to forget that amidst all this activism, she was living with this incredibly personal and painful situation.
Yeah.
This is what led her to medical research, right?
It did. In 1927, she founded the Neuroendocrine Research Foundation. This was at Harvard Medical School, and it was one of the first institutions anywhere that was specifically looking at the link between hormones and mental health.
So this went way beyond just helping Stanley. This was about pushing scientific boundaries in a field that was practically uncharted territory at that point. We've seen Katharine fight for women's rights, be an amazing wife, and really push things forward in medical research. It's pretty inspiring to see that level of dedication, on so many different fronts. But her story doesn't end there, does it?
Not even close. Remember how she challenged those feathered hat rules at MIT? Yeah, that independent streak. That never went away. She saw this problem at MIT, not enough housing for women students, and she decided to do something about it.
This is where Stanley McCormick Hall comes in, right?
Yeah.
The dorm at MIT, specifically for women.
That's the one. In the 1960s, Katharine donated a huge amount of money to get that dorm built. And it wasn't just about, giving them a roof over their heads. Back then, MIT could only house a tiny percentage of their female students.
So it was about more than just a place to live. It was about removing these obstacles that were keeping women from studying, from building careers in science and engineering.
Exactly. Stanley McCormick Hall, it meant way more women could go to MIT. It sent a really powerful message. It said, women belong here, in these classrooms, in these labs. It's like a testament to her vision. Katharine's vision of a future where women at MIT, they wouldn't just be accepted, they'd thrive.
It really is amazing how one person's actions can echo through time like that. But we haven't forgotten about the birth control pill, have we? We were circling that earlier.
Of course not. By the 1950s, Katharine was one of the main financial backers for Gregory Pincus, the scientist who was developing hormonal birth control. This is where her partnership with Margaret Sanger, remember they met during the suffrage movement, it comes full circle. They both saw how revolutionary, reliable birth control could be for women.
And Katharine, well, she put her money where her mouth was, literally. She gave millions to fund Pincus's research. Millions. That's like, tens of millions in today's money? That's serious commitment, especially back then, for research that a lot of people thought was, radical is putting it mildly.
It shows you how much she believed in this, how important women's health and empowerment were to her. Katharine recognized that for women to be truly free, truly equal, they had to be able to control their own bodies, their own choices.
It's incredible to think about the ripple effect, how many lives she touched, in ways she might never even have imagined.
That's the thing about Katharine Dexter McCormick. Her legacy, it's not just one thing, it's everywhere. She was a force of nature, whether she was fighting for the vote, pushing the boundaries of medicine, or fighting for access to contraception.
A life of purpose. She really embodies that, doesn't she? Using everything she had to make the world better.
She did. And that's a powerful message for all of us. It reminds us that what we do, even the small things, they matter. They can create change that outlives us all.
So, what will your legacy be? It's something to think about, isn't it? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the extraordinary life of Katharine Dexter McCormick. We'll see you next time for another fascinating story.